What happens when two seasoned business leaders get together? They talk shop, of course. Sit back and listen in as Scott DeLong and Vince Moiso share from their experience around current issues facing executives, entrepreneurs, and their leadership teams. The CEO Podcast starts now.
Hey everybody, Vince Moiso here with the CEO Podcast, and I'm here as always with my partner Scott DeLong.
Hey everybody,
we have a very special guest, the CEO Ivo from Commerce West Bank, CEO and original founder of Commerce West Bank. And I think what's important, and I've known Ivo for the last few years through Entrepreneurs Organization. And for all you listeners out there, we talk a lot about EO and YPO. Ivo's a member of YPO, has been for a very long time. Him and I have talked about those organizations are incredible international organizations that offer a high level of resources. And Ivo has been one of those resources. So he has come, I've listened to him speak several times on update to what's going on in the economy. And, in my sphere of influence, Ivo's at the top of that list. He's so close to the feds and really what's going on economically in this country that I really love and enjoy hearing what Ivo's comments are on that. And so we were just talking about, Scott, we were talking about the founding of Commerce West Bank. So Ivo, before we jump into a big conversation around the economy, I'd love for you to give our audience a little bit of your own background in founding a bank, growing it to where it's at, and certainly just talk about that journey a little bit.
Yeah, so I actually started in banking almost right after high school at 18. And I worked my way up from collections, teller, new accounts, branch manager, and so forth. I did really well. I think I was a vice president about 2021. I was a senior vice president at 22 or 23, and then kept on moving up from there. Eventually, I founded the bank 24 years ago. So I was 10. No, just kidding. I was actually 27 years old when I got approved by the regulatory agencies as the CEO of Commerce West Bank. We've grown. We're about a $1.2 billion company. Our focus is really on small and middle market companies between $5 million to $100 million in revenue, traditional businesses like manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, service companies, and professionals. So, yeah, so I wasn't planning to be a CEO or a founder, if I'm just being really honest. I think what is that old saying? Some people are destined for greatness, some people are thrust into greatness. At the time, I was thrusted into it because there was so many consolidation happening in banks in the 90s. I actually never left the bank. All these banks actually merged and kind of went away, and that just forced me to sort of play my hand.
Yeah, I was, you founded it. You were mentioning that, your original founder of the business, and then obviously put public offering around 2001. And part of the reason I was asking that of you and going into that conversation earlier was, I've been in the tile and stone industry for a long time. Like I launched my business career in that space many years ago, equally around the same time. And so I knew we actually, my previous business, I had two partners in that business, GBI Tile and Stone, and we banked with Commerce West, and
Wow.
But I knew Greg Games of Premier Tile, because I believe, if I recall, Greg was an investor in
Still a board member,
West.
actually.
What's that?
Still a board member of ours.
Yeah. So I figure as much. I haven't seen Greg in a very long time, but knew that involvement. So I always loved the small world stuff. And, a lot of people don't think of the tile or the flooring industry as having, that type of arm. So I found that interesting. Scott, sorry, I interrupted to tell that piece of the story. And
I wanted to hear more from, so we have a lot of younger people in our audience, right? And your trajectory from bank teller and mopping floors and doing all those things to all of a sudden the vice president at 21, senior vice president at 22, and then CEO by 27. Talk a little bit about that journey, because that's what the economy's interesting, but people are going to want to hear about that journey. And yes, you got thrust into it, but now all of a sudden you are thrust into it. And talk about the pitches that you had to make. Let's hear some of that story.
Yeah, so I think there's some rules before I start with that story as far as things that were explained to me later, but that I followed through my career. Number one was not to be attached to an outcome. It was attached to a process. So if you really think about it, a lot of us are attached to outcomes. We get a job. This is what we want. We want to become a doctor. Why do you want to become a doctor? Because my dad told me to, or my mom told me to. So I think the first thing was, if you're not attached to an outcome and you're attached to a process, you end up with sort of the best outcomes, right? But if you think of most people, we're very goal oriented, but we make it an attachment to that outcome. It's got to be that. I've got to make X. I got to do Y. I got to start a company. I just kind of let it evolve. The second thing was not being attached to being right. So I had to learn that earlier. Someone taught me that later, but I always did that. So I was always intellectually curious, not attached to being right, allowed me to present better than other people, allowed me to give me different strategies and alternatives, and allowed me to learn from people, even when they were bad managers. I used to tell myself, I'm going to learn something from this person, right? So there's always a takeaway. I tell my kids the same thing. So I try to do that a lot. So as I was moving up in my career, I think taking those two philosophical things, Scott, I think what was important was the first part is, I think hard work, determination is still a key to success, right? I know people say it, but I don't think they mean it. I think what you put in life is what you get. Now, I want to caution younger people to say this. I think Jeff Bezos is actually correct. I don't believe there is work-life balance. I believe there is work-life trade-off, is what he said. So just as a caution, I think as you work towards something, there's a trade-off to something else. And I think you just need to be cautious of that, right? So hard work and determination, people need to understand how much you put into something still gets. Number two, you have to have a lot of intellectual curiosity.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So intellectual curiosity was an important way for me to learn and adapt. And what I call pride or ego gets in a lot of people's way, right? It's the same thing. Pride looks a lot more humility, looks like someone that's very soft-spoken. But when you have pride, you actually have a form of ego where you don't learn anymore. You don't have intellectual curiosity. So for me, I always tell people, look, if you don't know, just tell me you don't know and ask a lot of questions. So I was always intellectually curious in terms of different aspects of things. And I think that's it. The third thing is, I'll just make it simple, is perseverance. I believe that a lot of people could be thrusted into greatness. Perseverance is a word I use because I think it allows you to get over the mountain. But people don't talk a lot about it. What I mean, all of us, like Ben, Scott, all of us have faced moments where we said, holy cow, I don't know if I want to go on. I don't know if I could take anymore. Or your business almost crumbled. If you've had a successful business, there's been times where you're like, where's the money? Holy cow,
yeah.
we just biggest client. We just thought. So I think perseverance, though, is a mental game. So I always like to describe Mike Tyson. I used to watch with my dad all the time, Mike Tyson pay-per-view. I don't care if it lasted 30 seconds or 60 minutes or whatever. It was great. First round knockouts. So I remember watching him in Tokyo when he took the loss, if you remember, right? Goes to Tokyo. Buster Douglas, the most dominating heavyweight fighter of all times, the youngest heavyweight champion of all time. And this guy was mean, right? He came out with no socks and everything. Remember that? Black shorts, you're like, you loved it. Now here's a guy, Buster Douglas, that was ranked in the middle of the stack, as I recall. He gets knocked out. My observation of perseverance ties into that story because here's why. Mike Tyson never won again. If you think most times in professional sports and including business, when you get knocked out, you get really knocked out. It's very hard mentally to have perseverance. It's very tough, right? So I tell people all the time, if you want success, we all talk about it a lot. It comes with a lot of failures, a lot of knockout. But that knockout of Mike Tyson has always got me back up. I said the problem with Mike Tyson was he was still the same. He could have fought a year later. But it was a psychological play. So I think for me, perseverance is psychological, not physical as much. You can go to the gym, do all that, but I think it's a mental game. So I always kept perseverance and that Mike Tyson story in the back of my mind, Scott, because I said, that's what Mike Tyson did wrong. He was the same athlete a year later. He had the same muscles, the same speed, the same athleticism, but he couldn't win, right? He couldn't win ever since that fight because it was a psychological effect. So I'll leave you with that.
So I'm going to come back because although your first point of hard work and your last point of perseverance, like we could go all day on those things. And I absolutely agree with both of those. I want to come up to the second point in the intellectual curiosity portion and the humility. So we grow up like being leaders, being in charge of whatever sports team, being in charge of whatever business you're in, being whatever charge. We're used to being the smartest person in the room. And frankly, that is so limiting. So I love the fact, because I do this exact same thing. My definition of humility is the fact that there is value in every human being, and I can learn something from anybody. And so that's where I tie my intellectual curiosity. And rarely have I heard anybody else put humility in with intellectual curiosity. So I want to tie back to that a little bit, because you're singing my song and I loved it.
Well,
So
Scott, as I was listening to Ivo, I felt like he could have been on every one of our
oh
podcasts,
yeah,
right? So,
yeah.
you could break down everything he said, and we've had a podcast on that exact topic. I mean, not being attached to outcomes is so humongous, right? So, hence the saying, "Trust the process." The outcome will be the outcome. I coach, run businesses on that. You know that, Scott. You and I feel the same, right? Nobody gets a reward for being right. You get nothing. There's no benefit. There's no, you're not getting a bonus for being
Yeah.
right. So when you can remove any attachment to being right, it opens up this whole brand new world for you. And then, we've talked about, I embraced, and I wish I would have embraced it earlier in my life, Evo, is just being a lifelong learner. So when you become curious, right, versus not, it opens up a whole brand new world for you. And I love, just there's no replacement for hard work at the end of the day. I couldn't agree more. I mean, you've got to pour maximum amount of effort, maximum amount of work into everything that you do, and you're gonna get results from that. There's just no question. So I believe in Tyson was a great reference, because I'm laughing that you even brought up Tyson, because as you're talking, my what came to mind for me was one of my favorite quotes is Mike Tyson says, "Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the face." Right? So the question is, what do you do when you get punched in the face and that plan is no longer the plan? You still have to be able to adapt and persevere, as you so eloquently put it. So yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I follow that. Yeah, I mean, no doubt. Look, we've learned, Scott's an EOer as well. So many of those learnings come out of that, your experience with IPO or EO, and surrounding yourself with people that, frankly, I love surrounding myself with people that are smarter than me, because I love learning. I'm always intellectually curious in that way.
Oh, you're welcome then, Vince. Just saying. Hey, well,
Yeah.
talk about your brand of intellectual curiosity, and how do you practice that, right? So it's great to say in theory, but talk about some of the practices that you deploy in your intellectual curiosity and the humility that you've attached to that. What do you do specifically when you're dealing with
I think
employees,
there's
for
maybe
instance?
two or three points of that, right? So about humility and intellectual curiosity. So one is a CEO friend of mine taught me this a long time ago, close friend. Whenever I went out and did a presentation, or I talked, or I had an idea or laid out a strategy, I always ask the question, what if I'm wrong? When you start off with that mindset, it's not the other way, where most people, if you notice, they do a presentation, they go at it strong. Like they are 100% right. This is the way it's going. So I always ask myself, what if I'm wrong? And I think that allows me in the presentation to listen to people, Scott,
Okay.
and allows me to really listen. What if I'm wrong? Where before, if you think about it, a lot of leaders will present on something, and it's a very binary discussion. It's not one that is really open to the senior management or the board or anybody else. They're like, no, this is the plan, and they defend it, right? They defend it to the hill, even if it's not right. So I think that's one thing. So humility is a very hard thing to practice, right? Number 2 point, when you have success. So keep that in mind. I think it's a very difficult thing when you have success. So I'm going to tell you what a billionaire once taught me. I'm sitting down with him over a glass of wine in the back of his house. He's much older than I am, been a client for a long time. And he says, "Hey, Ivo, you know what's funny? In our 20-year relationship, you've always given me coaching advice," which is kind of crazy, because you're like 40 years younger than me, but we've made a lot of money together on your advice, and you've been pretty accurate, pretty good. And in a lot of ways, I see you as the same age as I do, but you're not, right?" And he said, "Since I never gave you advice, can I give you one?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "You can always give. I know you could. You always ask me for it. I never give you one because you're freaking smarter than most people, and you always tell me what to do." And I said, "Well, what is it?" Because here's the one advice that I learned that I'm going to give to you. And I'm probably not supposed to say this, but it says, "Don't believe your own bullshit."
You're allowed to say that.
Yeah, no, very
And,
appropriate.
and I said, "What?" "Evo, I sold a business for X. Some guy comes up to me and says, Vince comes up to me and says, 'Evo, what do you think about opening a car dealership?' Yeah, I know a lot about cars. Yeah. Yeah. You think yeah, I could probably grow that. I bought it." Some guy comes to me, Scott, and says, "Hey, shoe business, women's shoes, really, really good business." And then he goes, "Yeah, successful in that." He goes, like, "Women's shoes, pretty easy to do." Got in that. I had to lose money over and over and over and over again until I realized I was believing my own bullshit. So that's about humility. That story got to me a lot, Scott. And it's a little more raw, but it gives you kind of an idea what happens when you have success. You start believing too much in yourself, right? Your own BS. And I think that's a filter on number 2 point there that I always use to make sure that I'm not believing my own BS, because it doesn't help, right? So I think the third thing is, if you're intellectually curious, you have to engage in the conversation with questions more than answers.
Yep. Yep.
A lot of leaders, when you notice they talk, they have a lot of answers. They're giving you answers. And I think if you're really of the mindset and you want to be mindful and you want to really have your intellectual curiosity, you've got to be able to ask a question to Scott and Vince and everybody else along the path as you're developing strategy or anything else. I think a lot of people forget that. So it's as simple as intellectual curiosity means you are curious about something. It's authentic and genuine, first of all. And you're actually asking Vince the question of saying, "Vince, what did you mean by that? Can you clarify that a little bit more? I don't really understand. My strategy is going right. You're going left. Why are you going left?" That's intellectual curiosity. But when you don't ask questions, you get away from intellectual. So it's as simple as an exercise that, are you actually asking questions and thinking mindfully what he or she is saying? And then are you actually asking questions? If you're not engaging. You don't really have intellectual curiosity, in my opinion.
So I like that a lot. In fact, I have a philosophy of ask, not tell. And you can do it in intellectual curiosity. You can do it in training, asking people how they might do something instead of telling them the right way to do it. I have a challenge a little bit. The not believing your own bullshit kind of story. I look at it, and you said, "What if I'm wrong?" is the question that you asked. I do it slightly different, and that's saying, how else could we think about this? How else would Ivo think about this? How else would Vince think about this? Because I might be right, but just because I'm right doesn't mean you're wrong. Or just because you're right doesn't mean I'm wrong. And I think we can get smarter together by discussing the possibilities, by asking questions. I've got a friend, Bob Donnell, who says this.
Now, let's think about that philosophy in reverse. I don't disagree with it, but think about my scenario saying, "What if I'm wrong?"
Yeah.
As soon as I say that, I put myself in the back of my own heels, and I'm actually asking Vince to convince me that my position is right, or he has a different position. Just think about that and pause. Meaning, when I ask the question, you're saying, "Hey, look, Vince might be right, he might be wrong." I'm saying, what if I'm wrong? Then I think it perks up my interest to say, I need to prove my thesis. I need Vince to prove. He turns around in response and says, "Ivo, that's a great idea. Here's the reasons why." Or he tells me, "Look, I would go in a different direction," than he would tell me. But again, it's just a little different perspective. When you're on the back of your own heels and you think you're wrong, I think the mindset is different. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying your approach.
Listen, if that's what works, I mean, for me, it works because it stimulates my curiosity to find out what other people are thinking. Because I have another belief in that we are smarter than me. The combination of our mindsets, right? That I'm going to we get into a discussion about something that I like.
Unless you're Elon Musk, though. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Get into something I like. And I'm not going to say it if I don't believe it. So here's what I think. And then I say, well, what do you think? Right. So a couple things can happen. One, you can validate my position. You might agree. Two, you might completely challenge my position. Or three, we can work together and create this hybrid, this synergy, getting together, these minds going together. And we're going to come up with something better than either of us would have thought of myself. So That's just my approach to it.
I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think I was trying to say that when you have success, if you don't come into a situation sometimes in the back of your heels instead of being neutral, I'm not so sure you listen as well as you think you do.
Yeah, it boils down to listening, right, Evo?
I
So
don't know if
like
that makes sense.
that's
That's what I'm trying to say. I think when you're in the back of your heels, and you have because you asked the question, Scott, where you said if you have a lot of success, how do you continue with humility? Humility is saying I might be wrong,
Sure.
right? So it kind of puts you in a different mindset all of a sudden, and you listen more to people. I believe instead of saying
right.
I believe I'm right, but Vince could be right too. Touche. You got an issue. I think if you think you're right, you think Vince is right. I'm not so sure sometimes in the entrepreneur's mind or a CEO mind or a C-level executive or any executive, you would say, well, I'm going to listen to it. Yeah, screw Vince. I think I'm still right. That's all I'm saying. It's just a mindset.
I think that's a mischaracterization of what I was trying to say. So, but I get it. Yeah, that's okay.
No, I think the comment that I would make on that is just really listening. So Scott, you and I have talked so much about this. Is so many times we listen when we're attached to an outcome or we're attached to being right. We're listening to respond. We're listening to defend. We're listening in a different way. So we're not really listening. When you remove attachment, right? And I've tried to, honestly, guys, the language is so important to me. And we talk about this a lot, Evo, in our podcast. I've tried to remove right or wrong, even those terms from my vocabulary and how I coach, teach, run a business, all of these types of things, because it's just my occurring, right? And then when I come from that place, that mindset, I listen so differently. I mean, we're talking about how to win friends and influence people. We're talking Dale Carnegie stuff here at this point. When I become genuinely interested in the answer, right, and I'm intellectually curious from a place of being genuine, that I want to know, my listening of that person is completely different.
Absolutely.
So I love that part. I'd love if we can transition, because I think
we want to go back to the topic we're supposed to start with.
I feel like we're waxing poetic at this point and getting incredibly philosophical, which I love to do. Both Scott and I love to do. I'd love to be able to transition to the economy, because I think tapping in for our listeners, tapping into what Ivo has to say would be huge. And we don't have a ton of time, Ivo, so I'm not looking for you to do what you would normally do in an EO or YPO presentation, but maybe there's one or two big things that you can share that we need to pay attention to this year. A couple things come to mind for me immediately, and things that I've heard in the past from you. One is the interest rate. Where's that going this year? And where's consumer spending at this year as we come off of the COVID hangover and the COVID money? Where because I know the signs in multiple markets are down, right? Consumer spending is considerably down. So where's that at? And then ultimately, what do we need to look out for? So like in my world, distribution, manufacturing, you talked a lot about inventory, and I still think in most industries and markets, we're in a place where inventory is destroying pricing, and you've got companies like, I'm looking at, Peloton just released their earnings. I was reading on that. Bowflex is hanging on by a thin thread. You got big companies, big names, longtime brands that are on the verge of who knows what. Like, unless somebody's going to come and save them, how does that impact the economy as a whole? So those are the things that came to mind for me. You know better, so I'll let you drive that conversation.
Yeah. So let's jump into it. Interest rates first, right? So we said the same forecasts in fourth quarter as we said, I think, in the EO event. We think the markets have it wrong, right? So the markets have projected 6 to 7 interest rate cuts starting in March. And we've always said that inflation, there's no question that inflation has peaked and we're in a deflationary environment, but we don't think it's a straight line. So we think it's very difficult that the Feds could actually do lower rates that quickly that fast.
Yeah.
And the other reason of that is I believe that Jay Powell and the board governors will also want seasoning. So just because deflationary pressures are evident in January or December, I think they're going to say, look, we'd like to see 1, maybe 2 quarters of deflation being consistent. And then I think they move. So as far as interest rates, we think there's a possibility of 2 to 4 rate cuts. But it probably the earliest we can see it start is somewhere like May, June is probably the earliest. And then so you might see it more on the tail end at the end of the year. I think the second question was interest rates and then consumer spending. So let me tie into consumer spending this way. Consumer spending, there's no question that the lower middle income group is more stressed than the upper income groups.
Yeah, of course.
And that's evident by credit cards, right? So credit card balances approached $1.1 trillion, actually exceeded $1.1 trillion. So it's the highest credit card balance ever recorded in U.S. banking history, to give you a perspective. But I believe there's something else happening. So on the consumer spending, it's just volatile, meaning that it's dying a slow death because of all the COVID stimulus money. But unemployment continues to be so low that we believe the consumers are still open to spending. And you saw that evident in December, where sales kind of rebounded back for malls and other retail stores. But I think it's a function really of the unemployment number. So I think the key of consumer spending is that unemployment number. The unemployment number today is 3.7. If you went to the one of my presentations in Ontario or the one here at the Pacific Club at the Ontario Airport, I said that the unemployment rate was the Goldilocks of the economy. If that unemployment rate goes up 0.5% or higher, I believe a recession could ensue within 4 months. The unemployment rate has continued to stay in that upper 3% range and hasn't moved. So I think as long as that happens, Vince, consumer spending is very difficult to predict because I think it comes in and out. It's almost like a big heavyweight fight. It just goes out and then it comes in, goes out. And then they're rotating what they're spending on services or consumer goods, right? So that's what we're seeing on that side of it. I'll end it with inventory, I think was your question. So if you look at interest rates over the next 2 or 3 years, and you look at what they call the dot plot, which is every board governor puts a little dot that they give us every quarter that tells them what they believe interest rates will be next quarter, the quarter after that, the quarter after that, next year, and the year after that. I can tell you that the dot plot looks like it's declining for the next 2 or 3 years. So if that's the case with inventory, I would tell you that you still have to move on inventory fairly quickly because 2 things could happen. One, the possible recession could occur, right? It could be that the soft landing occurred in 2023, and it could be that the soft landing is occurring in 2024. But eventually the recession cycle has to occur. So if you have interest rates, and here's the other scary part, if you drop interest rates 6, 7, 8 times, it's probably a sign that the economy is in trouble. So that's the inverse of people wanting rates to go down quickly. But if you believe that there's deflationary pressures, and if you believe interest rates are going down, that means your inventory is going to be worth less, if that makes sense. So what you have to be cautious about is that people were hoarding inventory for a while. And I think when we spoke last year, I said, look, everyone should offload inventory. Yeah. And I think that's still the same philosophy. I think you should use more like what the Japanese use, just in time. I think you want to time it as quickly as we don't look. The supply chain issue is primarily resolved. It's going to continue to get better. So I don't think you need to hoard a bunch of inventory. I think you need to use just in time wherever you can and minimize the exposure because if we don't have a recession this year, I believe it could be a tougher operating environment where you feel like a rolling recession. So what does a rolling recession really mean, textbook-wise? It means that certain industries will get hit and they'll just roll to different industries. So if you're in the trucking industry, I said you got hit last year, you continue to, but it'll keep rolling. So be careful if it keeps rolling and we don't get into an actual recession, then you're going to feel some pain. So the more that you can minimize your exposure on inventory and costs, the better you're going to be.
Makes total sense. Yeah, there's that trickle effect, right? Because if the freight industry is impacted, right, it's going to impact all industries really when you think about it, or whatever. If manufacturing gets impacted, or if it's whatever it might be.
The key to that unemployment rate. That's really, I believe, has been the frustration of the Feds. is that unemployment rate has stayed very, very, very low. And I think that's unprecedented when you raise rates, especially 525 basis points.
Yeah.
Unprecedented, right? And we haven't seen it. Now, part of that is a function of unemployment rate being so low. The consumers are still spending. Now, they're not spending anywhere near what they spent last year or the year before, but they're still spending, right? I mean, if you went to South Coast Plaza in December, you wouldn't have noticed anything. I mean, it was packed,
I
right?
know.
Luxury goods were still selling. And the last thing I'll mention about consumer behavior is this. What's unusual about this cycle, I'll call it, prior to every other recession cycle, the wealthy have always stopped spending early. I'll show you the charts one day. So they always stop spending. Now, wealthy people are kind of funny, right? They're a little more fickle. So they see news reports, they read the Wall Street Journal, they're talking to their associates and business colleagues on. They're like, man, this economy doesn't feel good. So all of a sudden, they basically take out all of their excess spending. They're like, look, I'm not buying it. Well, the house went down 10%. You still have this $20 million in the bank account. I think it might go down 20. I'm not buying it, right? So they usually pull back psychologically, not because of the money, because rich people are weird, right? They just all of a sudden like, it doesn't feel good. I'm not buying another car. It just doesn't feel good. I'm not buying a new table. I'm not buying new furniture. And you have the same amount of money. You both are shaking your head. You probably know people like that. You're like, you don't know. Listen, why don't we split dinner? Okay, I'm not doing this anymore. So that hasn't happened in this cycle because the wealthy got wealthier during COVID. Real estate balloon, PPP loans for their business, whatever it was, the wealthy got wealthier. I won't go into the details, but so this time around, what you'll notice is look at Porsches and Ferraris and everything else. You can't get a Porsche 911 GT3 ever. Meaning it's sold out for 3 years, all the way until the next model, which Porsche hasn't even announced what the next. Yeah, it's a Porsche. Yeah. Have you ever walked into a Porsche dealership, Scott or Vince, where you said, I just want a Porsche 911 Turbo? Well, look, we have to order it, and it's going to be above MSRP, and I don't know if we can get it for a year or two. You're like, no, I just want the Porsche. I'm not looking for an exotic Ferrari super model, right? So you go to Louis Vuitton. It's crazy. Go to South Coast. There's a line. Go to Rolex. You know what's crazy? You cannot buy a brand new Rolex. I don't know if you know this, anywhere in the world today. The inventory is 100% sold out. So if you walk in a Rolex store, you don't get really good service because it's almost like I'm trying to buy something, but they're like, am I doing you a favor or you doing me a favor, Ivo? I'm like, no, I want to buy something. You can't buy a Rolex any store in the world.
That's insane. I didn't know that.
All pre-sold for 2 or 3 years. So the crazy thing is, now you guys will notice. Go to any store in LA, Orange County, San Diego that's a Rolex dealer. Try South Coast. You walk in, you'll start noticing for display only because they've already been pre-sold to whoever it is they sold it to. So for display, they just want to show the models in. But go in there and try to buy one singular Rolex. Say, hey, I just want to buy one. Well, Vince, we'll call you in a couple of years if something comes up, and we'll let you know. So that has been driving the consumer behaviors that is unusual in this cycle, just so you know. So those are the factors.
I remember you said that, though, last year in your presentation, you said in order for the feds to achieve a soft landing, it was going to be solely on the backs of the wealthy continuing to spend. And you said if they continue to spend, you think that a soft landing is possible. Otherwise, I remember you also said a soft landing's never happened, right? I think it happened one time, years ago. And you said it was going to be totally dependent on what the wealthy do and what their spending habits are through all of this. So that's, it's good news to hear that because I remember that was like really in the back of my mind, and it's felt like that, right? And I've seen some of that. And I think you and I were having a conversation previously about the Porsche thing. And I think that's bizarre, but go to Ferrari, name the car. It's all
look
the
at
same.
The homes they're still selling for 20, 30 million, 10 million. They're still selling, right? So I think here's the part to understand economically for a lot of people. Approximately $10 trillion was thrown in by the government, right? $5 trillion from the government side, $5 trillion from the Federal Reserve during COVID. I don't think the other hand knew that the other hand was going to put in $5 trillion each, so $10 trillion came in. So people always ask me, well, Ivo, doesn't the money eventually go away? Not really. It's complicated to explain, but let me kind of break it down. If you throw $10 trillion into the system, you can call it printing money. I'm not going to get to that topic, but they did print money in order to get the $10 trillion in the system. It's very difficult to get it out. So number one, let me think about a transaction. Vince, you sell Scott a house. So you sell it for $1 million. Scott says, I'll take it for $1 million. Scott wires his money over to Vince. Vince now has $1 million cash. Scott has the house. Gets more complicated. Scott comes to me and says, Ivo, I want to refinance the house and pull $500,000. All of a sudden, there's an extra $500,000 in the system because I just refinanced. So think about the money only changed hands between Scott and Vince, the $1 million. It didn't go away in the system. So now Vince looks around and says, I think I'm going to buy a couple of Porsches. Well, you buy a couple of Porsches, guess what happens? Salesperson gets a little bit of money, Porsche gets a little bit of money, the mechanics, whatever you want to call it, the dealers. So all of a sudden it's spread around. They spend more money. So if you think about it, the money is kind of stuck in the system. Someone asked me, well, how does it go away? Right? Very simple. Number one, it could go away if the government decided to tax you more. So since they wrote all the stimulus check, I could go to the two of you and say, hey, every 3 months, can you write me back a $2,500 or $5,000 check until it's all gone from every single person in the U.S.? I don't think it'd bode well for any politician, right? I don't think you're not going to win an election by saying, I want to reverse engineer the 10 trillion and take 7 away from you. So that's not going to happen. Number two is the deficit. Just you go back to your economic class back in college, export minus import. We import more than we export, right?
Yep.
So the dollars, every time we have a deficit, just so you understand, mechanically leaves to another country. So that's another way to drain the $10 trillion. Outside of those two major components, there's not an easy way to drain it unless the third effect is the wealthy stop spending. So that's why the wealthy have so much, I'll call it upper income and wealthy. That's why they have so much of this wealth, because it's accumulated somewhere. And it's accumulated. That's why you're seeing the effect of Rolex and Porsche and Louis Vuitton and all that other stuff. That's economics like 404, but I try to explain a way where mechanically that's what's happening in the system, right? So people don't realize that. They're like, no, the money's going away. No, it's going away from the lower and middle income group, but it's getting to somewhere, right? Because the money just circulates in the system over and over again. And people don't realize that when I explained to you about the house transaction, now it kind of makes sense. The money just changed hands from Scott to Vince. It didn't really go away. It's in the system still. And Vince all of a sudden gets an issue like, this $1 million burning my pot. I had to spend all my money. And then Scott comes to me, makes it worse, says, Ivo, I think I want a $500,000 loan. Boom, more money in the system, right? I mean, you think about, again, your old economics class, you're like, holy cow, if commercial real estate and residential real estate keeps appreciating, guess what happens? There's more money in the system.
That's
and
right.
Residential, I think I've told you my base case. We said this for 2 years. We don't think that's an asset class you need to worry about. We think that asset class is stable for the most part. It doesn't go down like what it did during the global financial crisis. So hopefully that answers it.
No, it does. Scott, last word for you, because we're getting to that point. I think we're over our typical time, Scott. So I know you've probably got a couple questions, and I'll let you chime in. Last word.
I like the Econ 404 in like 10 minutes. That was great.
It was so good.
I appreciate that. But I don't want to miss on the soft skills stuff that we talked about at the beginning, because that's just my language, my friend. I can't wait to get to spend more time with you and talk more about these kind of concepts. So just for those of you who know, Vince has known Ivo for a little while, new to me. We are now serving on the board together at Working Wardrobes, which is an Orange County-based charity. And I'm really looking forward to spending some time with you.
Thanks, Scott.
Well, I think Ivo, if you're up for it, I think we look outward to a part 2. And I think there's so many things, if you're down for being our guest again, because I really appreciate you taking the time today and being our guest. It's really special, because I think what you just described, when you talk about Econ 404, that is gold, right? For anybody that's listening right now, it's really, to me, it's such gold to truly understand what's going on and have a deeper understanding of why. And so I think that's so helpful for me, especially when you're an entrepreneur.
For our listeners to think about, now that I have this knowledge, what can I do about that? What can I do for me, my family, my business, all that? So get your minds rolling, folks, and bring the questions on. We're happy to answer them in future podcasts. Just individual questions back and forth. We'll get you in touch with Ivo if you like as well. So I think this was a great episode. It went too fast. We went long too fast somehow. So really do appreciate it, Ivo. Thank you for your time. And for those of you that are listeners, thanks for listening. We really do appreciate it.
I appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for the CEO Podcast. Please visit us at theceopodcast.net, where you can learn more about our co-hosts and listen to past episodes. If you would like to have a discussion and dive deeper into any topic, there is also an option to contact Scott or Vince to schedule some time with them. Thanks for listening.